Who do you think you are, turning this in? Mrs. Blake's voice sliced through the air like glass. Her high heels tapped furiously on the linoleum floor as she held up a crumpled, oil-stained piece of scrap paper between her manicured fingers. The classroom fell into dead silence. All eyes were on the boy in the back, thin, dark curls half hiding his face, a threadbare hoodie too large for his frame. Caleb didn't look up. His knuckles were white from clutching the frayed strap of his backpack. "This is disrespectful," Mrs. Blake continued, her cheeks flushed. "I asked for typed essays. MLA format. Stapled." She tossed the paper onto her desk with a dramatic flourish. "Not some scribble on what looks like a grocery bag." But Principal Mendez, who had entered midway through the commotion, didn't speak. She picked up the paper, scanning it quickly. Then she stopped. Her brow furrowed. Then, without a word, she walked out, the essay still in her hand. It was always cold on Jefferson Street, even in April. The cracked pavement outside the Monroe apartment was a patchwork of forgotten repairs. The buzz of a faulty street lamp blinked like an old heartbeat above their doorway. Trash cans leaned crookedly along the sidewalk, and the front steps of their building were permanently stained with something you didn't want to name. Inside, apartment 2B smelled like old soup and secondhand dreams. The heater coughed more than it warmed, and the walls were thin enough for Caleb to hear the neighbors' TV arguments every night. The floor creaked with memory. But it was home. Caleb Monroe had learned not to complain. Complaining didn't put food on the table or fix the peeling ceiling in the kitchen. It didn't stop Mia's cough or make Mom's double shifts go any faster. Complaining just made things heavier. He was 14, rail-thin, and tall for his age, with curls that had long since grown wild. His clothes were always a little too big, not for fashion, but because they came from a donation box at church and the volunteers didn't ask for your size. You got what you got. If the jeans were 3 inches too long, you rolled them. If the hoodie had a broken zipper, you held it shut with one hand. He was used to watching the world from the edges, the back of the classroom, the corners of the hallway, the farthest table in the cafeteria. But he saw everything. That Monday morning, Caleb sat on the living room floor with a single sheet of paper in front of him. It was wrinkled, creased in 3 places, and had a corner torn off. On the edge of the page, a faded math worksheet from some other student's past still peeked through, a ghost of subtraction problems scrawled in blue crayon. This was all he had left in his notebook. Across from him, Mia lay asleep on the couch, curled into herself, her small frame wrapped in a hand-me-down throw blanket. Every now and then she coughed, sharp and dry. Caleb looked over at her and pressed his lips together. There was always worry in his chest, a kind of quiet tension that never left. He glanced back down at the paper. The assignment was simple, in theory, write a personal narrative. Tell the story that made you who you are. Due Wednesday. MLA format. Typed. Printed. Stapled. Mrs. Blake's expectations had been clear. But they didn't match reality. Caleb didn't have a printer. He didn't have Word or Google Docs. Their internet was a borrowed signal that sometimes worked when the wind blew the right way. He had a public library card, but the last time he tried to use the computers, he was kicked off after 30 minutes, just when he started typing. And right now, he didn't even have paper. The notebook he'd been using all year had long since given up. The final pages were now scattered across his life, one under Mia's drawing of a dragon, another holding a to-do list from his mom. A few were crumpled in the kitchen trash, half burned from trying to start the ancient stove. He sighed and leaned back, staring at the ceiling as the early morning light filtered through the slats of their crooked blinds. It wasn't just the lack of supplies. It was the feeling. How do you write about yourself when your whole life feels like something people avoid looking at? How do you describe who you are when the world's been trying to erase you since 2nd grade? Still, he tried. He picked up a pen, one he'd pocketed from the bus station last month, ink still surprisingly strong, and began writing on the last clean half of the paper. My name is Caleb Monroe. I live on Jefferson Street. But that's not what this story is about. He paused. It didn't sound right. He crumpled it and gently tossed it to the side. Then winced. He'd just wasted the last clean sheet. Damn it, he whispered under his breath. Then glanced at Mia, but she was still asleep. He stood up, stretched, and moved quietly to the kitchen. There, beside the fridge, was a drawer filled with junk, menus, receipts, expired coupons, and take-out napkins. Caleb rummaged through it like an archaeologist digging for ancient parchment. Then he found it, an old brown paper bag, folded flat, slightly stained with oil. He smoothed it on the table and ran his hand across it. The surface was rough but writable. He turned it over, made sure there were no holes. Good enough. He grabbed the pen again, sat down, and this time, he didn't hesitate. He wrote fast. Honest. Raw. No structure. No filter. I don't want pity. I just want to know if I'm allowed to dream here too, or if the American dream is only for kids with printers. By Tuesday night, the bag was full, front, back, and folded edge. His fingers ached, and he hadn't eaten since lunch, but something in his chest felt released. As if a piece of him had finally landed somewhere safe. He folded the bag neatly and slipped it into his backpack. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The next morning, he walked to school under a sky full of heavy clouds. The streets were still wet from the night's rain, and his shoes soaked through within 2 blocks. But he kept going. At school, he arrived just as the bell rang. The hallway was packed. Students brushed past him with earbuds in and AirPods out, faces locked on screens, laughter echoing in the stairwell. In room 108, Mrs. Blake stood at the front with a neat stack of printed essays in her hands. Caleb walked up to her, heart pounding, and handed her the folded bag. She looked down at it. Looked back at him. Raised one eyebrow. Where's your real essay? She asked. That's it, Caleb said, voice barely audible. She took it with 2 fingers like it was something dirty and dropped it onto her desk without a word. He walked back to his seat. And waited. Caleb didn't expect anything to happen. He knew Mrs. Blake wouldn't like it. He knew his essay wasn't what she wanted. And when she took it between 2 fingers like it was a discarded tissue, he expected exactly what came next. Still, he hadn't expected the volume. 10 minutes into class, she snapped. Class, please take out your essays and prepare to share the opening paragraph with your neighbor. Papers rustled. Keyboards clicked. Caleb kept his head down. Then he heard her voice rise sharply. Caleb Monroe, she said, loud enough for the room to quiet. Would you mind explaining this? He looked up. In her hand was the paper bag, now unfolded and held between her thumbs. It looked so much smaller from across the room, like a child's drawing taped to the fridge, out of place among the sleek white sheets stacked beside it. He didn't answer right away. Is this supposed to be funny? She asked. You think I'll accept this as a serious submission? This was supposed to be a formal narrative, not graffiti on trash. The class began to murmur. Some students exchanged looks. A few turned in their seats to glance at Caleb. He felt the heat in his cheeks, the pull in his chest. He didn't move. He didn't speak. I gave clear instructions, Mrs. Blake went on, her voice sharp and unwavering. Typed. Double-spaced. Proper formatting. And you hand me this? Still, Caleb stayed silent. Not because he didn't want to speak, but because he didn't know if his voice would work if he tried. Then the door creaked open. Principal Elena Mendez stepped into the room, holding a clipboard. Mrs. Blake noticed but didn't pause. If anything, she raised her chin, as if performing. "This," she said, holding the bag up higher, "is what happens when students think the rules don't apply to them." Principal Mendez froze for a moment. She glanced at the bag. Then at Caleb. Then back at the bag. "May I see that for a moment?" she asked. Mrs. Blake hesitated. "It's not really." "Please," the principal repeated. Reluctantly, the teacher handed over the brown paper bag. It looked even smaller in Mendez's hands, dwarfed by her clipboard and leather portfolio. She started reading. The room waited in awkward silence. The fluorescent lights buzzed above. A boy coughed. Someone's pen dropped and rolled across the floor. Mendez's eyes didn't move. She read quickly, then slower. Then she stopped. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, eyebrows slightly raised, lips parting by a fraction. She didn't say anything. Didn't hand it back. Didn't look at Caleb. Instead, she turned and walked out of the classroom. Just like that. Mrs. Blake blinked, visibly thrown. "Well, all right," she muttered, then cleared her throat and turned back to the class. "Let's continue." But the room didn't go back to normal. Caleb could feel the shift, in how people looked at him, how they leaned back, unsure of what had just happened. He didn't know either. He stared at the door. His essay was gone. Later that day. Caleb didn't know where she took it. Or why. After last period, he waited outside the office for half an hour, unsure if someone would call his name or if he was even allowed to ask. He stood by the drinking fountain pretending to read a flyer about summer internships, something he could never afford to attend anyway. Finally, just as he was about to leave, the assistant principal stepped out. "Caleb," she said. He froze. "She wants to see you. Come in." His heart pounded. Inside the principal's office, the lights were dimmer. Soft sunlight filtered through beige blinds. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon, probably a candle. The walls were lined with student artwork, certificates, and photos of past graduations. Principal Mendez sat at her desk, the paper bag essay laid out neatly in front of her. She had read it, that much was clear. The creases in the bag were flattened, and the ink was smudged slightly where her thumb had rested. "Sit down, Caleb." He obeyed quietly. She studied him for a moment. Not the way Mrs. Blake did, like he was a problem to solve, but like she was trying to remember something. "Did you write this yourself?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said. Then added, "I didn't have paper. Or a printer." She nodded slowly. "I figured." There was a pause. Then she reached into a drawer and pulled out a fresh sheet of stationery, official district letterhead. She slid it toward him. "I emailed this to the superintendent this morning," she said. "They want permission to share it at the board meeting next week. Anonymous, unless you're comfortable. Your choice." Caleb stared at the letter. His name was on it. So was the phrase. "The most honest expression of a student's experience we've read all year." I don't understand," he stammered. "You don't have to," she said gently. "You just have to keep writing." The letter stayed in Caleb's backpack the whole walk home. He didn't pull it out at the bus stop. He didn't show it to the crossing guard who gave him a small nod like always. And he didn't let it peek out when he climbed the narrow stairs to apartment 2B. It wasn't that he was scared of losing it. He was scared of believing it. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of canned soup and lemon-scented floor cleaner, a smell Caleb's mom insisted on using every Sunday, even though the mop was falling apart. He kicked his shoes off at the door and dropped his backpack onto the couch where Mia was curled up watching cartoons. She glanced up. "You're late." "Had a meeting," he replied. "With who?" "The principal." Mia's eyes widened. "You're not in trouble again, are you?" Caleb shook his head with a small smile. "No. Not this time. In the kitchen, their mom was heating water in the microwave for instant coffee, still in her uniform, navy blue shirt, name tag slightly bent at the corner. Her shoulders looked tired even before she turned around. "Hey," she said, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "Everything okay at school?" He paused. Then unzipped his bag and pulled out the letter. I think you should read this." She dried her hands on a towel and took the paper, eyes narrowing slightly as she scanned the formal heading. It didn't take long for her to find the key line. "Your son's writing has brought to light a voice we too often overlook. We would be honored to share it at next week's board meeting on equity and access." She looked up. "What is this?" "My essay," Caleb said. "The one on the paper bag." She stared at him, then the letter, then back at him. "Is this a joke?" she asked. He shook his head. "You turned in something on a paper bag," she repeated, slower this time, as if trying to believe it herself. "And now they want to read it in front of a room full of officials?" He nodded. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she sat down at the small dining table, the letter still in her hand. Her eyes lingered on the signature, Superintendent Vargas, and her fingers ran over the paper like she was testing if it was real. Caleb stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do. Finally, she whispered, "Your father, he would have cried if he saw this." Caleb's heart skipped. It wasn't something she said often. Not since the accident. Not since that last call from the hospital 2 years ago. "Do you think I should let them use it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She didn't answer right away. Then she looked him in the eyes, really looked at him, and said, "If you wrote something that made them stop and listen, even for a second, then yes. Let them hear you." He nodded slowly. Mia was still watching him from the couch, her eyes shining in a way that made him sit beside her and muss her hair until she squealed. He felt something shift inside him. Like the start of something that couldn't be undone. The next day, school grounds. Word spread faster than Caleb expected. By second period, 2 teachers had already asked him if they could peek at his essay. One counselor told him they were so proud. And during lunch, the vice principal personally handed him a flyer for the school's writing club, something Caleb didn't even know existed. Meanwhile, Mrs. Blake was unusually quiet in class. She didn't mention his name. Didn't reference the essay. Didn't say anything at all about the project. But she looked tense. That morning, she'd received an unexpected email from Principal Mendez, politely informing her that the student essay she had flagged as inappropriate would now be featured in front of the school board. Attached was a request that all students in her class be encouraged to attend if they wished. Her face had gone pale. Now, as she taught Shakespeare's Julius Caesar to a room of half-listening students, her mind kept drifting. Why that paper? Why his story? She remembered holding the bag, the way it had felt greasy in her hands, its creases stubborn and awkward. She'd barely skimmed it. She hadn't even read the second paragraph. But Principal Mendez had. And now the district had too. Thursday afternoon, behind the scenes. In a small meeting room on the second floor of the school board building, a group of administrators sat around a long oak table. Printed copies of Caleb's essay lay in front of them, triple-spaced and transcribed for readability, though one member still held the original, the brown paper bag now protected inside a plastic sleeve. "Raw," one of them said. "That's the word I'd use." Another nodded. "And honest. It says exactly what we've been afraid students might think, but never say." "It's not just what he said," Superintendent Vargas added. "It's how he said it. There's no blame in it. No anger. Just a question, do I belong here, or don't I?" Silence fell over the room. "We have to do more than just read this aloud," Vargas continued. "We need to respond." Friday, the invitation. When Caleb arrived at school on Friday, an envelope was waiting for him in homeroom. Inside was a typed invitation. You are formally invited to read your piece aloud at the school board equity forum next Tuesday evening. A car will be provided. Please feel free to bring 2 guests. Caleb stared at the words, then tucked them into his backpack before anyone could see. At lunch, he found a quiet spot outside by the science wing and sat alone with his thoughts. Not because he was sad, but because for the first time in a long time, he felt like something might be changing. He didn't know what it would look like. But he knew one thing. He would show up. And he would read. The car they sent wasn't fancy, just a dark blue sedan with a school district logo on the side, but to Caleb, it felt like a limousine. He'd never been picked up for anything before. Not for awards. Not for trips. Certainly not for reading something he wrote on a piece of trash. His mom sat in the front seat next to the driver, wearing her only good blouse, a lavender one she usually saved for interviews. Mia sat beside Caleb in the back, her hair tied in twin buns and a look of wide-eyed excitement on her face. You think they'll have snacks? She whispered. Caleb smiled nervously. I think it's more speeches and water bottles. She frowned. Boring. Then she looked him in the eyes, really looked at him, and said, if you wrote something that made them stop and listen, even for a second, then yes. Let them hear you. He nodded slowly. Mia was still watching him from the couch, her eyes shining in a way that made him sit beside her and muss her hair until she squealed. He felt something shift inside him. Like the start of something that couldn't be undone. The next day, school grounds. Word spread faster than Caleb expected. By second period, 2 teachers had already asked him if they could peek at his essay. One counselor told him they were so proud. And during lunch, the vice principal personally handed him a flyer for the school's writing club, something Caleb didn't even know existed. Meanwhile, Mrs. Blake was unusually quiet in class. She didn't mention his name. Didn't reference the essay. Didn't say anything at all about the project. But she looked tense. That morning, she'd received an unexpected email from Principal Mendez, politely informing her that the student essay she had flagged as inappropriate would now be featured in front of the school board. Attached was a request that all students in her class be encouraged to attend if they wished. Her face had gone pale. Now, as she taught Shakespeare's Julius Caesar to a room of half-listening students, her mind kept drifting. Why that paper? Why his story? She remembered holding the bag, the way it had felt greasy in her hands, its creases stubborn and awkward. She'd barely skimmed it. She hadn't even read the second paragraph. But Principal Mendez had. And now the district had too. Thursday afternoon, behind the scenes. In a small meeting room on the second floor of the school board building, a group of administrators sat around a long oak table. Printed copies of Caleb's essay lay in front of them, triple-spaced and transcribed for readability, though one member still held the original, the brown paper bag now protected inside a plastic sleeve. Raw, one of them said. That's the word I'd use. Another nodded. And honest. It says exactly what we've been afraid students might think, but never say. It's not just what he said, Superintendent Vargas added. It's how he said it. There's no blame in it. No anger. Just a question, do I belong here, or don't I? Silence fell over the room. We have to do more than just read this aloud, Vargas continued. We need to respond. Friday, the invitation. When Caleb arrived at school on Friday, an envelope was waiting for him in homeroom. Inside was a typed invitation. You are formally invited to read your piece aloud at the school board equity forum next Tuesday evening. A car will be provided. Please feel free to bring 2 guests. Caleb stared at the words, then tucked them into his backpack before anyone could see. At lunch, he found a quiet spot outside by the science wing and sat alone with his thoughts. Not because he was sad, but because for the first time in a long time, he felt like something might be changing. He didn't know what it would look like. But he knew one thing. He would show up. And he would read. The car they sent wasn't fancy, just a dark blue sedan with a school district logo on the side, but to Caleb, it felt like a limousine. He'd never been picked up for anything before. Not for awards. Not for trips. Certainly not for reading something he wrote on a piece of trash. His mom sat in the front seat next to the driver, wearing her only good blouse, a lavender one she usually saved for interviews. Mia sat beside Caleb in the back, her hair tied in twin buns and a look of wide-eyed excitement on her face. "You think they'll have snacks?" she whispered. Caleb smiled nervously. "I think it's more speeches and water bottles." She frowned. "Boring." The drive was quiet after that. Caleb looked out the window as the city passed by. They drove past the 7-Eleven where he'd found the bag, the corner bakery that no longer sold day-old bread, and the shuttered library branch where the computers never stayed online long enough. And then, up ahead, glowing beneath a string of low streetlights, stood the district building, tall, red-bricked, proud. It looked like the kind of place where decisions were made. Where people wore suits and spoke with calm voices and used words like implementation and equity. As they pulled up to the front entrance, Caleb's hands were sweating. He wiped them against his jeans, suddenly aware that his dad's old button-down was too loose in the shoulders. His shoes, scrubbed clean for the night, still had a small tear near the toe. He wondered if they'd see that first. Inside the forum. The school board forum was held in a large meeting room with rows of folding chairs, a small podium, and a panel of adults sitting behind a long table draped in navy blue. There were nameplates in front of each of them and microphones wired to speakers around the room. A banner hung from the ceiling. Student Voices Matter, a forum on equity in education. The seats were already half filled with teachers, staff, community members, and a few students in nice clothes. Caleb spotted Principal Mendez near the front, speaking with someone who looked like a news reporter. There were cameras, too, not many, but enough to make his stomach twist. The room buzzed with polite conversation and quiet shuffling. Then a voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. We're here to talk about the future, but we'll begin by hearing from the present." All heads turned toward the small podium at the front. "And tonight," the speaker continued, "we're honored to begin with a reading from a student whose words remind us what education is supposed to be about: understanding, access, and truth." A pause. "Caleb Monroe, would you join us?" The reading. His mom squeezed his shoulder as he stood. Mia gave him 2 thumbs up. He could barely feel his legs. The walk to the podium felt longer than any hallway at school. He unfolded the printout of his essay, freshly typed by the school office, with the original still tucked safely into a clear folder behind it. He looked up at the crowd. At the faces. Most were unfamiliar. But in the back corner. Mrs. Blake. She wasn't smiling. But she was there. Caleb took a breath. And began. "I don't want pity. I just want to know if I'm allowed to dream here too." His voice trembled at first, but he kept reading. He read about the nights with no power, about writing by flashlight while his sister slept on the couch. About searching for a piece of paper behind a gas station. About how hard it was to feel like he belonged in a place that measured worth by printed pages and clean shoes. And he read that line, the one everyone seemed to remember. "Or if the American dream is only for kids with printers." There was no rustling. No coughing. No movement. Just the silence that follows when people are listening. When he finished, he looked up. A beat passed. Then another. And then, a single pair of hands clapped. Then 2. Then the whole room. Some stood. A few wiped their eyes. Even the superintendent, who had seen 1,000 such meetings, looked like she'd swallowed something hard. Caleb stepped down, his knees shaking, but his chest lighter than it had ever been. He returned to his seat beside his mom. She didn't say anything. She just reached for his hand and squeezed it once, hard. After the applause. Once the clapping died down, the forum resumed. There were speakers with graphs and numbers, a slideshow about technology gaps, a teacher's testimony from a school with no functioning Wi-Fi. But Caleb barely heard any of it. His heart was still pounding. His mouth was dry. He didn't care if they remembered his name. He just wanted them to remember the truth. Back in the parking lot. The night air was cool as they stepped outside. "Proud of you, baby," his mom said, holding his shoulder as they walked. "I messed up a few lines," he replied. "Didn't matter." Mia twirled beside them. "They should put your paper in a museum." He laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. Then, a voice behind them. "Caleb." He turned. Mrs. Blake stood at the bottom of the steps, her purse clutched tightly in her hands. He straightened, unsure what to expect. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice softer than he'd ever heard from her, "I didn't read it." "Not really. I dismissed it before I even looked." Caleb didn't respond. "I was wrong," she added. "And I'm sorry." He nodded slowly. Then, with quiet clarity, he said, "I hope you'll listen next time." Mrs. Blake held his gaze, then gave a small, genuine nod. "I will." The next morning, Caleb stepped onto campus with a sense of unfamiliar stillness inside him. It wasn't pride exactly. It wasn't fame or joy or the kind of explosive celebration he sometimes saw in movies. It was quieter than that. Like something had shifted just enough that the world didn't feel as heavy. He crossed the threshold of Lincoln High's main doors, backpack slung low over one shoulder, his hoodie sleeves rolled halfway to the elbows. The overhead lights flickered like always, and the bell still rang 5 minutes early. But now, people looked. Not with confusion. Not with mockery. With recognition. "Hey, Monroe," a senior called from near the vending machines. "That was you last night, right?" Caleb blinked. "Yeah. That was dope, man." The guy held up a fist. Caleb bumped it awkwardly, unsure what else to say. Further down the hallway, 2 girls he didn't know nodded at him with little smiles. One whispered something behind her hand. Caleb pretended not to notice. He wasn't used to being seen, and definitely not like this. At his locker, there was a note taped to the front. "You made us proud. Mendez." He folded it carefully and tucked it inside his notebook, right behind his unfinished short story draft. Mrs. Blake's room. In room 108, things were different. Caleb slipped into his usual desk near the back just before the second bell. Mrs. Blake was already at the front, organizing a pile of stapled assignments. The class was quieter than usual. Some students still scrolled through their phones, but others glanced Caleb's way, subtle and curious. A few seemed like they wanted to say something, but didn't. Mrs. Blake cleared her throat. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to talk about the reading from last night." Caleb's heart dropped. She looked directly at him, not harshly, but not with warmth either. Her expression was neutral. Controlled. "I made a mistake," she said to the class. "When Caleb submitted his essay, I judged it by how it looked. Not by what it said." The classroom was utterly still. "I didn't give it the respect it deserved. I didn't give him the respect he deserved. And I'm sorry." Somewhere near the front, a pencil rolled off a desk. No one moved to pick it up. Then Mrs. Blake added, "We talk a lot in this room about voice. About purpose. But voice doesn't always come in polished packaging. And sometimes, it comes from the kid you haven't been listening to closely enough." She turned back to her desk. "That's all. And that was it. No big apology. No emotion. Just a rare, raw moment of admission. It was more than Caleb expected. And enough. Principal Mendez's office. Later that afternoon, Caleb was called to the front office again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked straight in. Principal Mendez stood behind her desk with a grin that looked like it had been waiting all day. "I've got something for you," she said, sliding a small envelope across the desk. Inside was a printed email. Caleb read the bold header. Youth Voices Essay Showcase, Statewide Nominee Invitation. Beneath that, a short paragraph. Congratulations, Caleb Monroe. You have been selected as one of 4 students to represent your district at the California Youth Writers Forum in Sacramento next month. He reread it twice before looking up. Wait. Sacramento? You've earned it, Mendez said. And don't worry, travel and accommodations are covered. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no idea what to say. Also, she added, we've started something else. She turned her monitor around. On the screen was a simple web page with the school logo and a bold headline. The Scrap Paper Project, Real Stories. Real Voices. Caleb's mouth dropped slightly. Starting next week, we'll be opening a small student-led workshop, a place where students can write, share, and submit personal stories. Doesn't matter if it's typed, scribbled, written on cereal boxes, if it's real, it's welcome. And we'd like you to co-lead it. Caleb stared at her. Me? You? He hesitated. But I'm not. I don't know how to lead anything. You led last night, she said simply. Now we just want you to keep going. A new kind of class. By Friday, the change in tone had spread. In English class, Mrs. Blake introduced a new assignment, Voices from the Margins, write a story from your truth, however you want to present it. The formatting rules. Gone. The grading rubric. Adjusted. For the first time, some students turned in pieces on the backs of napkins, notebook scraps, and recycled flyers. One girl submitted a letter addressed to her estranged father. Another wrote lyrics about growing up in a one-bedroom apartment with 5 siblings. And no one laughed. Something real had been sparked. And it was catching. Monday morning, another kind of echo. At his locker, Caleb noticed something odd. A small piece of cardboard had been wedged into the slats. He pulled it out. It was a rectangle cut from the side of a cereal box. On it, written in pencil. I don't have a laptop either. But I want to tell my story. Can I come to your workshop? D. Caleb smiled. Then flipped the cardboard over and wrote one word in bold letters. Yes. The library had never been this full after school. Tables usually sat empty or cluttered with overdue textbooks. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, and the librarian rarely looked up from her desk. But today, the reading corner had been rearranged, 5 chairs in a loose circle, a flip chart pushed against a wall, and a table with a box labeled, Use What You've Got. Inside were scraps of paper, torn notebook pages, even flattened cereal boxes and receipts. Caleb stood near the window, nervously adjusting the sleeves of his hoodie as students trickled in. He'd thought maybe 2 people would show. 6 came. A 7th peeked in, then slipped away. Hey, said a voice behind him. This seat taken. It was the same kid who'd left the cereal box note, Daniel. He had thick glasses, a mop of curly hair, and a spiral notebook that looked like it had been rescued from a recycling bin. Nope. Go ahead, Caleb replied. Daniel sat and glanced around. So, what do we do? Just talk. Caleb swallowed. Yeah. Kind of. Right. Talk. Share. No grades. No judging. Daniel nodded slowly, skeptical. Do we have to read it out loud? Not unless you want to, Caleb said. This is just a place where your story counts, no matter what it's written on. A girl across the circle raised her hand. You're not a teacher, right? Everyone chuckled. Caleb did too. Nope. I'm just someone who knows what it's like not to be heard. She smiled and pulled a folded napkin from her backpack. The first story. Her name was Layla, a junior with long braids and a notebook full of poetry she never turned in. She started by reading a short piece, soft at first, voice trembling, eyes mostly on the floor. I'm loud at home but silent in class. 'Cause truth gets marked down when it don't come with grammar. They want commas and quotes, but I bring scars and slang. So I write in my head, where no red pen can hang. When she finished, no one said anything for a moment. Then Daniel clapped. And the others joined. Layla looked up, surprised. You liked it? It was real, Daniel said. And that's the whole point, Caleb added. We're not here to be perfect. We're here to be heard. The circle expands. The next day, 8 students showed up. Then 10. By the following week, the circle had moved from the library to the art room just to fit the chairs. Some students came with nothing but their voices. Others brought stories scribbled on the back of grocery lists or receipts. One girl shared a letter to her brother in juvie. Another wrote an obituary for a version of herself she said she buried in 7th grade. Caleb listened to them all. At first, he wasn't sure what his role was supposed to be. He didn't think of himself as a leader. He didn't grade papers. He didn't fix grammar. He didn't give speeches. But he gave space. And sometimes, that was enough. Not everyone was pleased. One afternoon, after the 3rd workshop, Caleb was called to the front office again. He walked in expecting another invitation. Instead, he found Mrs. Blake standing near Principal Mendez's desk, arms folded, lips tight. Mendez gestured for Caleb to sit. We've had some questions raised about the writing group. Caleb's stomach turned. What kind of questions? Mrs. Blake spoke before Mendez could. Some faculty are concerned about academic standards, she said. There's talk that students are being encouraged to turn in work that's unstructured. That it's creating a culture where form doesn't matter. Caleb blinked. But the group isn't about grades. It's just about writing, honestly. I understand that, Mrs. Blake said. But the message is bleeding into classrooms. I've had students challenge rubrics, refuse formatting requirements. One even said, Caleb said I don't need a computer to matter. Caleb looked to Principal Mendez. She nodded slowly. I think this is a growing pain. Change always creates tension. But I want you to keep going, Caleb. Mrs. Blake's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. The challenge. Later that evening, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling above his bed, thinking about what Mrs. Blake had said. Was he doing something wrong? Were the stories they shared, raw, messy, unformatted, a threat to the rules? He got up quietly, careful not to wake Mia, and sat at the kitchen table. He pulled out a napkin from the counter and began writing. Not for school. Not for the board. Just for himself. The truth doesn't always wear a tie. Sometimes it shows up in ripped jeans. With no headers or footnotes. But it's still truth. Still worth reading. A breakthrough. The next workshop brought something unexpected. Daniel, usually quiet, always scribbling but never sharing, finally raised his hand. I wrote something, he said. It's not a story, really. More like a list. Go for it, Caleb said. Daniel unfolded a wrinkled sheet of notebook paper. His voice shook, but he read. Things I've never told anyone. 1. I eat lunch in the bathroom sometimes because I don't want to explain why I have the same sandwich every day. 2. My mom can't read, so I read her mail to her, even the bills. 3. I write fake report cards to make her feel proud. 4. I haven't cried since 4th grade, but I feel like I might every time I write. 5. This is the first place that made me feel okay about that. Silence. Then, tears. Not just Daniel's. Someone passed him a tissue. Another kid stood and wrapped him in a quick hug before sitting back down, head lowered. Caleb watched it unfold, unscripted, real, powerful. This was what stories did when given room. They opened. They connected. They healed. It started with a single line, written in red marker on the back of a torn pizza box. Sometimes, silence is just fear in disguise. Caleb found it on the desk after one of the Tuesday workshops, and signed. He didn't know who wrote it. But it stayed with him all night. The next afternoon, he pinned it to the wall of the art room, right next to the whiteboard no one used. By the end of that week, 5 more quotes had appeared. Then 10. Students wrote on whatever they had, napkins, ticket stubs, paper plates, sticky notes, even an old detention slip. No names. Just truths. Quiet confessions turned public declarations. Their words formed a mosaic of raw honesty across the once bare wall. Someone used glitter pens. Another underlined their quote in highlighter. One kid wrote their message in Sharpie directly on masking tape, then stuck it over the light switch. By the following Monday, a piece of lined notebook paper was taped dead center. This is the first wall that doesn't keep me out. The title came naturally after that. The Wall of Real, hand-lettered in uneven black strokes by Caleb and 2 others, the name stuck. Students began inviting their friends, telling them, you don't even have to talk. Just write something. The circle was growing wider than Caleb had ever imagined. Spotlight. He didn't notice the reporter at first. She sat in the back of the Thursday workshop, wearing a gray sweater and jeans, a small camera case at her feet. It wasn't until Layla whispered to him, "Dude, I think that lady's from Channel 5, that he started to panic. After the session, the woman approached. Caleb Monroe. He nodded warily. My name's Aaron Wells. I'm doing a piece on youth-led literacy and creative expression in underserved communities. Your principal said I should see this for myself. He blinked. Oh. Okay. I'd like to interview you, if you're willing. No pressure. Just talk. She was kind. Gentle. Curious, not invasive. Still, something about being noticed made Caleb uncomfortable. He didn't want to be turned into a headline. He didn't want the workshop to feel like a product. But Erin promised she wasn't after spectacle. And when she asked him, why does this matter? He gave the most honest answer he could. Because no one should have to fight to be heard. The segment. 2 nights later, the segment aired. It was short, barely 4 minutes, but it captured everything, the kids sitting in a circle, Caleb reading aloud, the wall of real glowing in the background. Snippets of student quotes flashed across the screen in silent text. I'm not invisible. I'm just not rich. Pain doesn't need paragraphs. Words saved me when people couldn't. Caleb's voice closed the piece. Maybe writing on a paper bag isn't about poverty. Maybe it's about power, the power to say, I exist. The next morning, the school was buzzing. Even the janitor gave him a nod and said, I saw you on TV, son. You did good. Resistance returns. But with attention came friction. On Friday afternoon, Caleb was called to another meeting, this time with a district curriculum coordinator, 2 board members, and Principal Mendez. Mrs. Blake was there, too. There were compliments, first. Your initiative is impressive. You've sparked something meaningful. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. Then came the pivot. But we're receiving concerns about the structure, said one board member. There's a worry that the informality of the workshop might be sending the wrong message, that anything goes. That grammar, formatting, and academic rigor don't matter. Caleb sat up straighter. That's not what we're saying. Mendez chimed in. They're learning to trust their voices first. Mechanics can come after. This is about access. Mrs. Blake looked conflicted, like she wanted to speak but wasn't sure where she stood anymore. The coordinator smiled tightly. We're simply suggesting that you adapt the workshop into something more aligned. Perhaps offer writing prompts tied to the curriculum. A peer editing component. Rubrics. Objectives. Caleb felt the weight of it, the pressure to tame something that had only worked because it wasn't tamed. He asked, quietly, can we think about it? Mendez nodded. Let's give it a week. The debate. That evening, Caleb brought the news to the group. They were gathered in the library, now nearly 20 strong. They want to formalize it, he explained. Turn it into something more like a class. Daniel frowned. So. It'll be graded? No, Caleb said. But they want structure. Rubrics. Prompts. The usual stuff. Layla crossed her arms. That's what the rest of school is for. This was supposed to be different. It still can be, Caleb said. But we need to figure out how to protect what we've built, without making it seem like we're rejecting everything. A girl named Marisol spoke for the first time. Can't we have both? Like, one part that's open, one part that's guided? Daniel nodded. Split sessions. Free write first, then skill building after. Caleb looked around the circle, a room full of kids who were becoming leaders without even realizing it. He smiled. That could work. The letter. That weekend, Caleb wrote something he'd never thought he would, a proposal. Not an essay. Not a speech. A formal document, 1 page long, neatly typed, with help from the school office, and signed by every workshop member. It read. We believe in the power of structure. But we also believe that before you can polish a voice, you have to let it speak. The wall of real is more than a project, it's a doorway. We ask that you let it stay open. He submitted it Monday morning. By Wednesday, the district responded. Approval granted. No changes required, as long as they welcomed optional guidance for those who wanted it. Everyone wins. But more importantly, everyone speaks. It was the first day of spring break, but Caleb still walked to school. The campus was quieter than usual, no bells, no rushing footsteps, no teachers herding students into classrooms. Just birdsong and the low hum of maintenance crews working in the distance. He moved through the courtyard with his hands in his pockets, his hoodie zipped halfway up despite the warmth. He wasn't going to class. He was visiting the wall. Over the last few weeks, it had grown beyond what anyone had imagined. It had spilled out of the art room, crept into the adjacent hallway, and now curled across an entire stretch of corridor near the main office. Hundreds of pieces of paper, folded, torn, illustrated, anonymous, were layered like bricks, each one holding a story, a voice, a piece of truth. I sleep with the light on because nightmares don't knock. I'm not lazy. I'm just tired of pretending I'm okay. Every time I write, I feel like I exist a little more. Some entries were a single sentence. Others took up entire pages. One was written on a brown lunch bag. Another had been stitched, yes stitched, onto fabric with blue thread. A girl in the sewing elective had decided paper wasn't enough. What had started with a folded paper bag now lived in dozens of formats. And that morning, right in the center of it all, something new had been posted. Fresh paper. Bold handwriting. I almost missed this moment because I was too focused on rules. But now I see the beauty in the mess. Thank you. It was signed. Mrs. Blake. Caleb stood in front of it for a long time, his fingers resting lightly on his backpack strap. He didn't smile. He breathed. Then he took out a piece of paper and added a new entry right below hers. "We're all just drafts. Keep revising. A visitor from downtown." Later that week, while the students were still on break, the school received a visitor. Ms. Irene Hart, an editor from Riverlight Publishing, stepped quietly into the hallway, escorted by Principal Mendez. She wore round glasses, a soft linen jacket, and carried a notebook full of scrawled observations. "I saw the Channel 5 segment," she said. But even that didn't do this justice. She stood before the wall for nearly half an hour without speaking. Then she turned to Mendez. "I want to publish this," she said. "You mean, some of the stories?" Mendez asked. "No," Ms. Hart replied. "All of it. The wall itself. Photographs, transcriptions, maybe some context from the students. But I want to preserve the rawness. No edits. No polish." "You'd need their permission," Mendez said. "I want their voices," Hart said. "Not just their words." The decision. The next week, Caleb brought the idea to the group. They'd reconvened after break, 23 students crammed into the art room, still surrounded by markers, tape, scraps, and hope. "A publishing house wants to make a book out of the wall," he said. "Like, an actual book. In stores." The room buzzed with excitement. "For real? Like, with our names? What if I don't want mine in it?" Caleb held up a hand. "It's completely optional. Anonymous pieces will stay anonymous. And if anyone doesn't want their story included, it won't be." Daniel looked up from his notes. "What about you? Will your name be in it?" Caleb hesitated. That question had been sitting with him since the call with Ms. Hart. Her tone had been clear, "This is your movement. The voice behind it matters." But Caleb wasn't sure. He didn't want this to become his story alone. It had never been just about him. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I think this book isn't about the people behind the names. It's about what's true. If we keep it true, it'll work." Layla smiled. "Truth doesn't need a signature. Legacy in print." 3 months later, the book was published under the title The Wall of Real, Stories That Weren't Supposed to Be Told. It made its way into public libraries, local bookstores, and a few school reading lists. Each page was different. Some were photos of handwritten entries. Others were typed, preserved word for word. The foreword, written by Ms. Hart, simply said, "This book is not perfect. But neither is life. That's why it matters." Caleb's piece was in the first few pages, the one he'd written on the bag, reprinted in facsimile, creases and all. There was no author name attached. Just a title. "If I'm not loud, am I still here?" The next kid. It was almost the end of the school year when Caleb met him. A new student, Elijah, short, round-faced, eyes wary. He had transferred mid-semester from a different district, and no one seemed to know much about him. He was quiet in class, always sketching in the margins of his notebook. Never turned in his writing assignments. One afternoon, Caleb found him standing in front of the wall, staring at a quote. "No one heard me until I wrote it down." "You like that one?" Caleb asked. Elijah jumped slightly, then nodded. "I don't really write. I draw more. But I get it. You don't have to be a writer to tell your story," Caleb said. "We've got a spot open in the circle, if you're ever interested." Elijah didn't answer right away. Then he pulled a small sketch from his backpack, a single-panel comic. A boy standing in a room full of people with tape over his mouth. He was holding a pencil. The last panel showed the pencil turning into a megaphone. "Can I put this up?" he asked. Caleb smiled. Only if you want the whole school to see what power looks like. Looking back, looking forward. That summer, Caleb sat at his kitchen table late one night, writing in a notebook Mia had given him for his birthday. It was clean. Untouched. The kind of thing he would have been too afraid to use back when he thought clean pages were too good for him. He wrote. I used to think voices only mattered if someone gave you permission to speak. But now I know, some stories don't wait for permission. They find their way out, through ink, through tears, through courage. And sometimes, all it takes is one sentence to change everything. He paused. Then flipped to the next page. And began again.